Have you heard what happened to Sophie Wessex today? At first, the news was little more than a whisper carried on the cold breeze outside Windsor Castle, a rumor that even seasoned royal watchers refused to believe. But within hours, it became an undeniable reality, shaking the walls of one of the world's most stoic institutions. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, collapsed in what witnesses are calling a deeply alarming medical episode. And while the palace has remained predictably tight-lipped, sources close to the royal family are already asking a chilling question. Did her past trauma come back to haunt her? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It's hard to imagine Sophie Wessex, the royal family's so-called quiet strength, as anything other than composed. For over 2 decades, she's carried herself with dignity through triumph and tragedy, earning respect in a family often marked by scandal and division. Yet today, she was the one in need of strength, as doctors rushed to stabilize her and worried whispers spread among senior royals. What triggered this shocking turn of events? Medical experts are now pointing to a possible connection between Sophie's collapse and the immense toll her past has taken on her body, particularly her harrowing experiences with pregnancy that nearly claimed her life not once, but twice. And if that theory is true, it raises another disturbing possibility. Did the palace fail to take her warnings seriously? In this story, we are going to uncover the emotional and medical journey of a woman who has often been overlooked in the glare of royal spotlight. We'll explore the heartbreak that defined her path to motherhood, the dangers she faced in silence, and how unresolved trauma may have set the stage for the terrifying events of today. But more than that, we'll ask hard questions about the culture of secrecy within the royal household and whether Sophie's cries for help were muffled beneath the weight of duty. The image of Sophie Wessex lying unresponsive is almost too painful to imagine for those who know her story. In the early hours of this morning, she was reportedly attending a small private gathering with Prince Edward when she suddenly appeared faint and unsteady. Witnesses described a brief moment of confusion before Sophie fell to the floor, her husband's cry for help breaking the silence of the room. Everything happened so fast, one source told a British tabloid. One moment she was smiling and chatting. The next she was pale and struggling to breathe. It was terrifying. Within minutes, medical staff were on the scene, stabilizing Sophie and transporting her to a nearby hospital under a blanket of secrecy. While initial statements from Buckingham Palace insisted she was receiving the best possible care and was in stable condition, there was no denying the unease rippling through the monarchy. What makes this incident even more unsettling is the growing chorus of doctors and health experts suggesting that Sophie's past medical trauma may have played a decisive role in her collapse. For years, she has quietly carried the scars of 2 near-fatal experiences: an ectopic pregnancy in 2001 that left her fighting for her life, and a placental abruption in 2003 during the birth of Lady Louise Windsor that almost ended in tragedy. She suffered catastrophic internal bleeding during her first pregnancy loss, recalls one royal biographer. That kind of trauma doesn't just go away. It leaves both physical and emotional marks that can resurface years later, especially under stress. And stress is something Sophie knows all too well. Since Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's departure from royal life, Sophie has stepped up as one of the monarchy's most reliable and hardworking members. She has shouldered increased public duties with little complaint, even earning praise from Queen Elizabeth II as an invaluable support to the crown. But could that quiet dedication have come at the cost of her health? The palace has long been criticized for its culture of silence when it comes to the health of its members. From Queen Elizabeth's stoicism about her ailments to Princess Diana's battles with eating disorders, the royals have often projected an image of perfect strength while hiding their vulnerabilities. In Sophie's case, insiders say there were recent signs of exhaustion. Cancelled engagements, a noticeably thinner frame, and a rare emotional moment caught on camera last month when she appeared to wipe away tears during a Remembrance Day service. It's entirely possible that Sophie was sending out warning signals, but in a family where duty comes first, those warnings might have been brushed aside, said one palace staffer on condition of anonymity. So where does that leave us now? The Duchess of Edinburgh remains under close observation, with no official word on what caused her collapse. But as the world watches and waits, one question lingers in the air like a haunting refrain. How much more can one woman endure before her body and soul give out? This is not just a story about a royal collapse. It is a story about resilience, sacrifice, and the hidden toll of living behind palace walls. It is about a woman whose courage in the face of loss inspired millions, and whose health crisis now forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treat those who seem unbreakable. And as the palace scrambles to reassure the public, another question arises. Has Sophie's quiet suffering finally reached a breaking point? Beginning, the collapse and its shocking impact. Middle, Sophie's history of trauma and its possible connection to today. End, emotional reflection and teasing the larger questions the story will explore. The stillness inside the private dining room of Bagshot Park, the residence Sophie Wessex shares with Prince Edward, was shattered in an instant. It had been a quiet, almost idyllic afternoon. The Duchess was hosting a small gathering with close friends and a few trusted staff members, her laughter floating through the air as she recounted anecdotes from a recent royal engagement. To those present, she appeared the picture of health, her trademark composure and grace on full display. But what no one knew was that beneath her serene exterior, a storm had been gathering for years. One moment, Sophie raised a delicate hand to adjust the pearl earring brushing against her neck. The next, her smile faltered, her eyes widened slightly, and she staggered backward, clutching the edge of the polished oak table for support. A glass of water tipped over, the sound of shattering crystal echoing as guests leapt to their feet. Prince Edward, seated to her left, was the first to reach her side. "Sophie," his voice cracked with panic. There was no answer. Sophie's knees buckled, her body crumpling toward the floor. Edward's arms caught her just in time to soften her fall, but her head lolled against his shoulder, her face pale as porcelain. The room descended into chaos. "Call an ambulance," someone shouted, fumbling for their phone. A staffer ran for the estate's medical kit as another rushed to alert security. Edward cradled his wife's limp form, his face ashen with fear. "She's not responding," he murmured, his voice almost breaking. Within minutes, the estate's emergency response team arrived, their expressions tight as they assessed the Duchess's condition. A pulse was found, faint but present. One medic pressed an oxygen mask to Sophie's face, while another checked her vitals, whispering instructions with practiced calm. Edward remained crouched beside her, refusing to let go of her hand, his knuckles white as he gripped her delicate fingers. Witnesses later described the scene as surreal, almost dreamlike, as though the gravity of what they were witnessing hadn't yet settled in. "She's always been so strong," one staffer said tearfully. "To see her like that, so fragile, it didn't feel real." News of Sophie's medical emergency spread like wildfire through the royal household. By the time the ambulance's blue lights flashed against the ivy-covered walls of Bagshot Park, senior royals had already been informed. King Charles, still navigating his own health challenges, reportedly expressed immediate concern, instructing aides to keep him updated by the minute. Princess Anne, known for her stoic demeanor, was said to have gasped audibly upon hearing the news. Outside the estate, a different kind of frenzy was beginning. Paparazzi had yet to descend, but word of unusual activity at Bagshot Park reached the ears of royal reporters within the hour. Speculation bubbled on social media, with hashtags like #PrayForSophie and #DuchessEmergency trending before official confirmation arrived. Buckingham Palace issued a statement just before sunset. Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Edinburgh experienced a medical incident earlier today. She was transported to hospital as a precautionary measure and is receiving the best possible care. The family requests privacy at this time. It was a typically measured response, calm, controlled, and devoid of detail. But behind closed doors, insiders say the mood was anything but calm. For Prince Edward, the events of the day were reportedly hauntingly familiar. Friends of the couple recall how, more than 2 decades ago, Edward came terrifyingly close to losing Sophie during a late-night dash to the hospital when her ectopic pregnancy ruptured. The memory of that night, they say, has never left him. And now, as he followed the ambulance carrying his wife away, that old fear returned with a vengeance. Doctors at Frimley Park Hospital, the same medical center that once saved Sophie's life during her daughter's birth, began immediate assessments. Sophie was conscious upon arrival but disoriented, sources revealed. Initial tests were conducted to rule out stroke, heart attack, and other acute conditions. Yet even as physicians worked to stabilize her, questions began swirling about what might have caused such a sudden collapse. Among the first theories to emerge was the possibility that Sophie's medical history, fraught with complications, may have left her body more vulnerable than anyone realized. "She's endured more than most people know," said one royal commentator. 2 near-death experiences, years of emotional strain, and now the pressures of being one of the monarchy's most visible faces post-Megxit. It all adds up. Indeed, those who know Sophie best describe her as someone who has always pushed through pain. After her ectopic pregnancy in 2001, she returned to public life with quiet determination, refusing to let her heartbreak overshadow her duties. 2 years later, she narrowly survived placental abruption during Lady Louise's premature birth, an ordeal that left both mother and child fighting for their lives. Yet Sophie never allowed the public to see her struggle. "Her resilience is extraordinary," said a former palisade. "But even the strongest people have limits. And in the royal family, where appearances are everything, I fear her cries for help may have gone unheard." In the hours following Sophie's hospitalization, Prince Edward remained at her side, declining to leave even for meals. Photographs later captured him looking drawn and exhausted as he stepped out of the hospital for a brief phone call, his face lined with worry. As night fell over Windsor, the royal family braced for what one insider described as an anxious vigil. What they did not yet know was that Sophie's collapse would ignite a storm of scrutiny, not only about her health, but about the pressures and silences that have long defined life inside the palace. Did the Duchess's devotion to duty blind her to the warning signs her own body was sending? Or was she ignored by an institution notorious for prioritizing image over well-being? The answers may not come easily, but one thing is certain. Sophie Wessex's sudden collapse has shattered the illusion of royal invincibility. And as doctors work to uncover the cause, the world is left wondering whether this was simply an isolated incident or a tragic consequence of years of unspoken suffering. Long before the titles and royal duties, long before she was hailed as the Duchess of Edinburgh and admired for her unwavering poise, Sophie Rhys-Jones was a woman who carried dreams of family deep in her heart. For years, she imagined the laughter of children echoing through the halls of Bagshot Park, their small hands gripping hers as she guided them into the world with love and care. But what Sophie could not have known then was how bitter and cruel the path to motherhood would be, a path littered with pain, near-death experiences, and the kind of heartbreak that leaves scars no one else can see. In 2001, Sophie was a newlywed of just 2 years, still adjusting to life within the royal fold. The pressures were immense. Every step she took was analyzed, every word scrutinized. But through it all, she remained focused on her and Edward's shared dream, starting a family. When the news came that she was expecting, it seemed like a quiet blessing, a private joy in a life so often played out in public. Yet the joy would prove tragically short-lived. Sophie was in her home office at Bagshot Park when she began to feel an intense, stabbing pain in her lower abdomen. At first, she tried to dismiss it as something minor, perhaps a pulled muscle or a stomach bug. But as the minutes ticked by, the pain grew sharper, almost unbearable. When she stood to reach for the phone, a wave of dizziness overtook her, and she collapsed onto the floor. It was Edward who found her, his face draining of color as he saw his wife curled on the carpet, clutching her stomach, her skin clammy and pale. He called for help, his voice shaking as he barked orders to staff. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and whisked Sophie to King Edward VII's hospital, sirens wailing as Edward followed closely behind. At the hospital, doctors quickly discovered the cause. Sophie was experiencing a ruptured ectopic pregnancy, a life-threatening condition where a fertilized egg implants outside the womb, usually in a fallopian tube. The pregnancy was not viable, and worse, the rupture was causing massive internal bleeding. She came dangerously close to dying, recalled one of the medical team years later in an off-the-record conversation with a royal biographer. Had there been even a slight delay in getting her to hospital, we might have been looking at an unimaginable tragedy. Surgeons worked frantically to save her, removing the ruptured fallopian tube and stemming the bleeding. Edward waited outside the operating theater for hours, pacing the corridor with his head in his hands, reportedly muttering prayers under his breath. The surgery was a success, but the emotional toll was devastating. Sophie awoke to the news that not only had she lost the baby, but her chances of conceiving again had been severely diminished. At just 36 years old, the reality of infertility hung over her like a dark cloud. Publicly, Sophie maintained her composure. A brief palace statement acknowledged that she had suffered a medical emergency and was recovering well. But the truth of what happened, the heartbreak, the danger, the crushing fear, was kept from public view. Behind the scenes, Sophie struggled to process the loss. Those close to her say she would often sit for hours by the window of her bedroom at Bagshot Park, staring out at the gardens with a distant look in her eyes. She spoke little during those days, her once bright laughter replaced by an eerie silence. "It was like a part of her had gone with that baby," said a longtime friend in a rare interview. She blamed herself, even though she shouldn't have. That's the kind of person Sophie is. She carries everything inside, always trying to be strong for everyone else. As months passed, Sophie threw herself into royal duties, attending engagements and smiling for cameras even as she grieved in private. But behind that serene exterior, the fear lingered. Would she ever be able to carry a child to term? Or had her one chance at motherhood slipped through her fingers forever? 2 years later, in 2003, Sophie's hope was rekindled when she discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy progressed further, and for a brief period, there was cautious optimism within the royal household. But the nightmare was far from over. At 35 weeks, Sophie suddenly went into premature labor while at her home. The situation turned critical when doctors discovered she had suffered a placental abruption, a rare and dangerous condition where the placenta detaches from the uterine wall, depriving the baby of oxygen and nutrients and putting the mother at risk of severe hemorrhaging. There was no time to lose. Sophie was airlifted to Frimley Park Hospital, accompanied by a team of medics who worked feverishly to stabilize her on the flight. "I remember looking at her and thinking, she might not make it," said one of the paramedics later. In the operating room, doctors performed an emergency cesarean section to deliver baby Lady Louise Windsor. The tiny infant, weighing just 4 pounds 9 ounces, was immediately transferred to the neonatal intensive care unit. Meanwhile, Sophie's condition remained critical. She had lost a significant amount of blood, reports later suggested as much as 2 pints, and doctors fought to keep her alive. For Edward, the hours that followed were the longest of his life. He stood at Sophie's bedside, clutching her hand as monitors beeped and medical staff moved swiftly around them. She was so pale, Edward once confided to a friend. "I thought I was going to lose her and our daughter on the same night." But once again, Sophie pulled through. Against the odds, both she and baby Louise survived the ordeal. But the experience left Sophie deeply shaken. "It changes you," she later admitted in a rare interview. "You realize how fragile life is. You realize how easily everything can be taken away." Those close to Sophie say she never fully recovered from the trauma of her pregnancies. Though she went on to have a second child, James, Viscount Severn, in 2007, the emotional scars from her earlier ordeals ran deep. "She has always carried those experiences with her," said a family friend. "She doesn't talk about it much, but you can see it in her eyes sometimes." The pain, the fear, the memory of how close she came to death. Now, as Sophie lies in a hospital bed once more, doctors are asking a haunting question. Could the lingering effects of those traumatic pregnancies have contributed to her sudden collapse? One medical expert told the press, "Placental abruption and ectopic pregnancy can have long-term consequences for a woman's health, particularly if there was significant blood loss or damage to reproductive organs. Add years of stress, and it's a dangerous combination." The theory is deeply troubling, not least because it suggests Sophie's past trauma, long buried beneath her calm exterior, may have finally caught up with her. As the world waits for answers, Sophie's journey through heartbreak and near-death experiences serves as a powerful reminder of her quiet strength. But it also raises uncomfortable questions about whether she ever truly had time to heal, or whether the relentless demands of royal life pushed her to ignore her own needs. And if so, was this collapse an accident, or the inevitable outcome of years of silent suffering. For most couples, the birth of their first child is a time of unfiltered joy, the culmination of dreams and hopes for the future. But for Sophie and Edward, the arrival of Lady Louise Windsor was not simply a miracle. It was a battle for survival, one that left both mother and child teetering on the edge of life and death. Even now, over 2 decades later, the memory of that night hangs over Sophie like a shadow she can never quite escape. It was early November 2003 when Sophie, 7 months pregnant, began experiencing what she thought were harmless twinges. She had been advised by her doctors to rest as much as possible due to complications detected earlier in her pregnancy. Sophie had already endured one devastating loss, the ectopic pregnancy that almost claimed her life in 2001. And though this time had felt more promising, there had always been a quiet undercurrent of fear in her heart. At Bagshot Park, Sophie had kept her schedule light in recent weeks. Her days consisted of reading, quiet walks in the garden, and small visits from family and friends. The Duchess, typically poised and self-sufficient, had finally allowed herself to slow down. But even then, she never let on just how anxious she felt. She was determined to carry on as normal, said a close aide who was present during those final weeks. Sophie has always been incredibly private about her struggles. She didn't want anyone fussing over her. But on November 8th, those quiet twinges suddenly became something much more sinister. Sophie woke in the early hours of the morning to a sharp, tearing pain in her abdomen. Alarmed, she tried to stand but immediately felt a rush of warmth between her legs. Blood. Panic coursed through her as she cried out for Edward, who was sleeping beside her. He awoke instantly, his heart pounding as he saw his wife clutching her stomach, her nightgown already stained red. "I remember the look in his eyes," one family friend later recounted. "He thought he was going to lose her right there and then." A call to emergency services set off a flurry of activity at Bagshot Park. Doctors on the line instructed Edward to keep Sophie lying flat and still while paramedics sped toward the estate. Within minutes, Sophie was loaded into an ambulance, her face pale, her lips murmuring prayers between shallow breaths. It was later determined that Sophie had suffered a placental abruption, a condition in which the placenta detaches from the uterus prematurely. This medical emergency deprives the baby of oxygen and can trigger severe blood loss in the mother. It is rare but often fatal if not treated immediately. The journey to Frimley Park Hospital was tense. Sophie drifted in and out of consciousness, gripping Edward's hand so tightly he could feel her nails digging into his skin. "Don't let me die," she whispered at one point, her voice barely audible over the sirens. "You won't," Edward assured her, though his own fear was almost unbearable. At the hospital, Sophie was rushed straight into surgery for an emergency cesarean section. Lady Louise Windsor was born shortly after, weighing a fragile 4 pounds 9 ounces. But she was whisked away to the neonatal intensive care unit before Sophie could even see her. Meanwhile, Sophie was not out of danger. The placental abruption had caused massive hemorrhaging, and doctors struggled to control the bleeding. For hours, Edward waited outside the operating theater, pacing back and forth as his mind cycled through the worst possibilities. "I thought I was about to lose the 2 most important people in my life," Edward later confided to a close friend. It took several blood transfusions and the tireless efforts of a team of surgeons to save Sophie's life. When she was finally stable enough to be moved to recovery, Edward was allowed to see her. She looked almost unrecognizable to him, pale, weak, and utterly drained. Yet when she saw him, she managed a faint smile. "Is she alive?" Sophie whispered hoarsely, referring to the baby she hadn't yet held. "Yes," Edward replied, tears streaming down his face. "She's alive because of you." But it would be several days before Sophie was strong enough to meet her daughter. Lady Louise, born prematurely and struggling to breathe on her own, was kept in an incubator. When Sophie was finally wheeled into the NICU, the sight of the tiny infant brought her to tears. "She looked so small, so delicate," Sophie later said in a rare interview. "I was terrified to touch her, terrified I might hurt her." In that moment, relief mingled with guilt. Sophie felt gratitude for her daughter's survival, but couldn't shake the fear that her body had betrayed her yet again. "I kept asking myself, what if I hadn't made it? What if she hadn't made it?" Sophie admitted. Those questions never really leave you. Recovery was slow and painful. Sophie was kept in hospital for over 2 weeks, during which time she required further treatment for anemia brought on by the blood loss. Edward remained by her side throughout, canceling all royal engagements to care for his wife and newborn. When mother and child were finally discharged, it should have been a joyous moment. Instead, Sophie carried home not just her baby, but also the heavy weight of trauma. Friends noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. She became more reserved, less eager to talk about her feelings. Even in public, Sophie seemed more subdued. Her once radiant smile was still there, but it didn't always reach her eyes. She put on a brave face, said one confidant. But those who knew her well could see she was struggling. The whole experience had shaken her to her core. Though Sophie would later go on to give birth to her son, James, in 2007 without complications, the memory of Lady Louise's perilous arrival never faded. She never stopped worrying, recalled a royal aide. Even years later, she'd watch her children sleep and get this faraway look in her eyes, like she was remembering how close she came to not being there for them. Now, in light of Sophie's sudden collapse, doctors are looking carefully at her medical history. Some experts believe the immense strain her body endured during those years could have long-term repercussions, particularly under sustained stress. Placental abruption and massive hemorrhage can lead to cardiovascular issues later in life, said one consultant physician. It's possible Sophie has been carrying the physical echoes of that night with her all along. The idea is chilling, that even as Sophie presented an image of perfect composure in her public life, her body may have been quietly keeping score of every trauma endured. And with her collapse today, the question now becomes unavoidable. Was this the moment her past finally caught up with her? In the aftermath of those harrowing years, the ectopic pregnancy that nearly claimed her life and the traumatic birth of Lady Louise, Sophie Wessex emerged as a woman marked by pain but defined by resilience. To the outside world, she seemed to embody serenity. Every photo of her at royal engagements, every speech she gave at charity functions, painted a picture of grace under pressure. But behind the towering gates of Bagshot Park and the polished walls of Buckingham Palace, few could understand the depth of what Sophie had endured, or the quiet strength it had taken to keep going. Even as she recovered from her near-fatal experiences, Sophie chose to return to her royal duties far earlier than many expected. Doctors advised her to rest, warning her that her body needed time to heal from the tremendous strain of placental abruption and blood loss. But Sophie, ever the dutiful member of the monarchy, insisted on resuming public engagements just a few months after giving birth to Lady Louise. She didn't want to be seen as fragile or weak, said one former royal aide. She felt an enormous sense of responsibility, not just to the Queen, but to the institution itself. Sophie believed that if she faltered, she would be letting everyone down. At first glance, her determination seemed admirable, even heroic. While other royals were swept up in tabloid scandals and public feuds, Sophie quietly focused on her work. She championed causes related to vision impairment, military families, and sexual violence prevention, often visiting organizations and hospitals without the glare of press photographers. Over time, she became known as the unsung heroine of the royal family, someone who kept the ship steady while others rocked it violently. But beneath the surface, there were signs that Sophie was still grappling with the aftershocks of her medical trauma. Close friends observed that she was often anxious, particularly when away from her children. When Lady Louise was hospitalized for a minor eye condition in her toddler years, Sophie reportedly sat by her daughter's bedside for 48 hours straight, refusing to eat or sleep until doctors assured her the child was out of danger. She had been through so much to bring those children into the world, said a confidant. Every cough, every fever terrified her. There was this unspoken fear that she could lose them as easily as she almost lost her own life. At times, that fear translated into physical strain. Sophie began experiencing migraines that left her bedridden for days, though she rarely let on publicly. On one occasion, she even attended a charity gala while battling a severe headache, her staff begging her to cancel. "That's Sophie in a nutshell," said the aide. "She'll put her own health second, third, or even last if she thinks someone is counting on her." As the years passed, Sophie took on an increasingly prominent role within the royal family. After Prince Philip's retirement in 2017 and the exit of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle in 2020, much of the monarchy's burden fell on her and Edward. Sophie began accompanying Queen Elizabeth II to more engagements and was even seen comforting Her Majesty during Prince Philip's funeral, a quiet hand of support during one of the family's darkest hours. Behind closed doors, however, the cost of this unwavering service began to show. Palace insiders whispered about Sophie's visible fatigue during long tours, the occasional tremor in her hands as she gripped the edge of a podium. Once, at a private luncheon, she was seen excusing herself suddenly and returning minutes later looking pale but composed. Duty was her armor, explained one observer. She wore it so well that even those closest to her sometimes forgot she was still healing inside. Medical experts are now speculating that this pattern of self-sacrifice, always prioritizing others above herself, could have exacerbated any lingering health issues from her past. Chronic stress can suppress the immune system and strain the cardiovascular system, said Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a specialist in post-traumatic health. For a woman with Sophie's history of severe obstetric complications, that could leave her vulnerable to sudden collapses or other acute medical events. It's a theory that rings chillingly true for those who know her story. And yet, Sophie never complained publicly. She never used her platform to speak about her own struggles, preferring instead to shine a light on the pain of others. Even after her frightening experiences, she spoke only briefly about her pregnancies in interviews, describing them as difficult, but downplaying the danger she had faced. It's just not in her nature to dwell on her own pain, said a longtime friend. Sophie has this idea that as a royal, you must bear your hardships in silence. But silence doesn't heal wounds, it deepens them. Today, as Sophie lies in a hospital bed after her sudden collapse, questions are being asked about whether that quiet strength has come at too high a cost. Was she ever given the space and time to truly recover from the physical and emotional traumas of her past? Or did life behind palace walls demand that she bury her pain beneath layers of duty and decorum? The answer, much like Sophie herself, may never be fully revealed. But one thing is certain. The woman known as the royal family's steady hand has been carrying more than her share of the weight for far too long. And now, the cracks in that strength are beginning to show. In the wake of Sophie's sudden collapse, a chilling question has begun to echo through the corridors of Windsor and in the minds of those watching from afar. Were there signs that this was coming? And if so, did anyone take them seriously? The British royal family has long been celebrated and criticized for its unwavering commitment to duty, a philosophy best summed up in the late Queen Elizabeth II's famous words, "Never complain, never explain." But that culture of silence, that stiff upper lip approach to life's hardships, may have been the very thing that left Sophie Wessex vulnerable. For years, insiders say, there were subtle warning signs that Sophie's health might not be as robust as her serene public appearances suggested. Small cancellations of royal engagements, hushed mentions of exhaustion, and rare but telling moments where her composed mask seemed to falter. Yet in a family where vulnerability is often equated with weakness, such warnings rarely spark action. A royal staff member, speaking anonymously, shared a memory from just a few months ago that now feels loaded with significance. She came back from a grueling overseas tour, 5 countries in 7 days, and she looked utterly spent. We suggested she take a week to rest, but she smiled and said, "There's still work to be done." She's always been like that. She hates letting people down. To those who knew her best, that quiet determination to push through was both inspiring and troubling. "Sophie's not the type to cry for help," said a family friend. Even after her traumatic pregnancies, she returned to duty with hardly a pause. She thought that's what was expected of her, to smile, wave, and carry on, no matter what was happening inside. But medical experts warn that unresolved trauma doesn't simply fade with time, especially when combined with chronic stress. Women who have experienced severe obstetric complications, like ectopic pregnancy or placental abruption, are at higher risk of cardiovascular issues later in life, explained Dr. Harriet Monroe, a specialist in maternal health. If you add the psychological impact of such events and years of high-pressure public life, the risk compounds dramatically. And yet, within the palace, these risks were never openly discussed. The royals have a long history of keeping health matters tightly under wraps, often to maintain an image of invincibility. Queen Elizabeth II herself rarely spoke about her ailments, even when she was hospitalized. Princess Margaret's struggles with illness and addiction were concealed for years, and Prince Philip's health scares were typically downplayed until they could no longer be hidden. It is within this culture that Sophie found herself, expected to soldier on, her own needs secondary to the crown. There's a sense in the royal family that personal suffering must always be subordinated to the institution, said royal historian Alicia Beaumont. When you're born or married into that world, you're taught very quickly that the show must go on. But did that mindset leave Sophie without the support she needed? In the months leading up to her collapse, there were whispers in royal circles about Sophie's increasing workload. With Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's departure from senior royal duties and the king's scaled-back schedule due to his own health concerns, Sophie and Edward had quietly become two of the most reliable faces of the monarchy. "She's been working harder than ever," said a source close to the palace. "It's no exaggeration to say she's the glue holding certain aspects of the family's public image together." Yet behind the scenes, there were hints that the pace was taking its toll. Aides noticed Sophie rubbing her temples during long car rides between engagements, closing her eyes as though battling a headache. On one occasion, she was seen gripping the railing of a staircase for balance at a charity event, her face momentarily contorted in discomfort before smoothing into her familiar smile. "She brushed it off when we asked if she was okay," said an attendee. "She said she just felt a little lightheaded, probably from standing too long. But looking back, maybe it was something more." Such incidents didn't escape the notice of royal watchers, either. In recent months, several tabloids had published stories speculating about Sophie's health, noting her slimmer frame and occasional cancellations. But the palace responded with the same refrain it always does: no cause for concern. Now, as Sophie lies in a hospital bed, those words feel hauntingly hollow. Could her collapse have been prevented if the warning signs had been heeded? Or was Sophie herself too conditioned by the palace's culture of stoicism to speak up? "Silence is woven into the fabric of royal life," said Beaumont. "They are taught from the earliest days to keep their private struggles private. It's seen as a form of strength, but in reality, it can be incredibly isolating." That isolation may have been compounded by Sophie's personality. Unlike some of her in-laws, she has never courted the spotlight or sought sympathy from the public. Even when recounting her near-fatal pregnancy complications in rare interviews, she framed her experiences in matter-of-fact terms, careful not to elicit pity. "She doesn't like to make a fuss," said one longtime friend. But sometimes, not making a fuss can be dangerous. As doctors work to determine what caused Sophie's sudden medical emergency, the conversation is beginning to shift. This isn't just about one woman's collapse. It's about the heavy toll of royal duty, the dangers of suppressed trauma, and an institution that has historically prioritized image over well-being. And for Sophie, the question remains: was she ever truly given permission to heal? If her past warnings were ignored or never voiced at all, perhaps this was the inevitable breaking point. In the gilded world of monarchy, duty isn't just a word. It's a code that governs every decision, every smile, every carefully orchestrated appearance. And for Sophie Wessex, that unspoken code became both her armor and her prison. The quiet, unassuming woman who entered the royal family as a commoner was never meant to become one of its most visible faces. Yet as history unfolded and scandals reshaped the House of Windsor, Sophie found herself thrust into a position of immense responsibility, one that would demand more from her than anyone could have imagined. When Sophie married Prince Edward in 1999, she was determined to carve out a role for herself within the royal structure. She understood the delicate balance required to thrive in an institution steeped in centuries of tradition. Sophie was neither flamboyant like Princess Diana nor polarizing like Camilla Parker Bowles. Instead, she chose a path of quiet service, often working diligently behind the scenes rather than seeking the spotlight. For years, this strategy served her well. Sophie became a trusted confidant to Queen Elizabeth II and was widely admired by royal aides for her professionalism and discretion. The late Queen reportedly referred to her as a safe pair of hands, High praise in a family where public missteps can carry devastating consequences. But while the public saw only the polished exterior, the impeccable outfits, the serene smile, few realized how much Sophie was sacrificing to keep up appearances. "She's the epitome of composure," said a former palace press officer. But behind that calm facade, she was carrying an enormous amount of pressure, especially as the monarchy evolved around her. That pressure began to intensify in 2020 when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle announced they were stepping back from royal duties. Their abrupt exit left a void in the family's operational structure, particularly as the younger generation had been poised to take on more public-facing roles. Suddenly, the burden of representing the crown at countless engagements fell heavily on a much smaller circle, and Sophie, along with her husband Edward, became central figures in the palace's efforts to maintain stability. "She didn't hesitate," said an insider familiar with royal scheduling. "The moment it became clear there was a gap to fill, Sophie stepped up without complaint. She increased her workload, often traveling for days on end, attending events back-to-back. She was determined to show that the family was united and capable. But as admirable as her dedication was, it came at a personal cost. By late 2021, staffers began to notice subtle signs of strain. Sophie was seen leaning heavily on Edward's arm during long receptions, her normally brisk stride slowing. On one overseas tour, she reportedly skipped 2 evening functions, citing fatigue. In private, aides quietly suggested she take a step back to recuperate, but Sophie refused. She'd say things like, "It's nothing I can't handle," or "Other people have it worse," said one senior aide. But we could see the toll it was taking. The pressure to perform wasn't just external, it was deeply internalized. Sophie understood that every royal engagement, every hospital visit, every charity gala, was more than just a photo opportunity. It was part of an elaborate dance that kept the monarchy relevant in a modern world. To falter, even briefly, was unthinkable. "She believed in the work," said a close friend. "That's what kept her going even when she was exhausted. But sometimes I wonder if she mistook exhaustion for commitment. There's only so much a human body can endure before it demands to be heard." Those fears were compounded by her lingering anxieties about her past health issues. After nearly dying during Lady Louise's birth, Sophie had quietly lived with the fear that her body might betray her again someday. And yet, she never allowed herself the luxury of slowing down. "It's like she felt she had to prove something, not just to the public, but to herself," said the friend. "She'd survived so much already that she didn't want to admit there were still limits." This relentless drive did not go unnoticed by the Queen, who reportedly admired Sophie's work ethic and frequently sought her counsel in her later years. After the Queen's death in 2022, Sophie's responsibilities expanded even further under King Charles III. She became a cornerstone of the slimmed-down monarchy Charles envisioned, a dependable figure whose quiet dignity contrasted starkly with the turmoil swirling around the younger royals. But as Sophie's public profile grew, so too did the expectations placed upon her. She attended hundreds of engagements annually, often traveling across the UK and abroad to support charitable causes. She became a patron of more than 70 organizations, ranging from military charities to children's hospitals. On the surface, she seemed to thrive in the role. Photos of Sophie greeting veterans or comforting young patients painted a portrait of effortless compassion. Yet for those who saw her in unguarded moments, the cracks were beginning to show. She'd be in the car after an event, shoes off, head in her hands, recalled one aide. She rarely complained, but you could tell she was running on fumes. In hindsight, some believe her sudden collapse was not a random event, but the culmination of years of physical and emotional strain. "The human body can only take so much," said Dr. Amelia Price, a stress management specialist. Prolonged exposure to high-pressure environments, combined with unresolved trauma, creates a perfect storm for serious health incidents. Within the royal household, there are now quiet murmurs about whether more could have been done to protect Sophie from herself. "She has always been the one supporting others," said a palace source. But who was supporting her? It's a haunting question, one that casts a long shadow over the carefully cultivated image of the British monarchy as a family that looks after its own. As Sophie lies in hospital, doctors working tirelessly to stabilize her condition, Her story forces us to confront the unspoken cost of royal life. Behind the pearls and the tiaras, behind the carefully worded statements and choreographed appearances, lies a woman who has given her all to a system that rarely allows its members to stop and breathe. And now, as her future hangs in the balance, the palace faces a reckoning. Was Sophie Wessex's collapse a tragic accident, or the inevitable result of a life spent carrying the weight of royal expectations? As Sophie Wessex lay in a hospital bed surrounded by monitors and murmuring doctors, a haunting thought began to circulate among medical professionals and royal observers alike. What if this wasn't simply about exhaustion or the stress of royal life? What if the seeds of her collapse were planted years ago, in moments of trauma her body never truly recovered from? To understand how Sophie reached this critical point, we must look back not just at the headlines, but at the hidden wounds she carried. Wounds that may have shaped her health in ways unseen and perhaps even ignored. When Sophie was rushed into emergency surgery in 2001 for her ectopic pregnancy, her life was saved by mere minutes. The ruptured fallopian tube and internal bleeding nearly took her from this world. Medical teams worked tirelessly, transfusing blood and repairing the damage to her fragile body. It was a traumatic experience by any measure, and while her physical injuries healed over time, experts say the lasting impact on her body's systems may have been more profound than anyone realized. An event like a ruptured ectopic pregnancy is not just a physical crisis, explained Dr. Evelyn Grant, a leading consultant in women's health. It's also an emotional and hormonal shock to the system. The body registers that trauma on a cellular level. In some cases, it leaves behind scar tissue, irregularities in vascular function, and even predisposes a woman to later cardiovascular or endocrine issues. Sophie's second near-death experience during Lady Louise's birth compounded these risks. Placental abruption, the cause of that crisis, is known in the medical community as a silent threat. Even after successful delivery and treatment, survivors are often left with an increased likelihood of high blood pressure, clotting disorders, and cardiac stress. Every pregnancy complication Sophie endured added another layer to her vulnerability, said Dr. Grant. We don't talk about this enough, but a traumatic reproductive history can echo across decades. The heart remembers, the vessels remember. And then there's the psychological toll. Sophie endured not just physical emergencies, but also the terror of nearly losing her child and her own life. That kind of fear doesn't evaporate when the crisis passes. It lingers, often morphing into hypervigilance, anxiety, and what specialists call trauma-related somatic disorders. The mind and body are deeply connected, explained Dr. Raj Patel, a trauma psychologist. Unprocessed fear and grief can manifest physically, in migraines, fatigue, even fainting spells. If she pushed those memories down, as so many public figures do, they may have found another outlet through her health. And push them down Sophie did. After Lady Louise's birth, Sophie rarely spoke publicly about the ordeal. In a handful of interviews, she described her pregnancies as difficult and admitted to being terrified during those moments. But she quickly pivoted to gratitude for the outcome. She didn't dwell, said a family friend. She would say, "It's in the past, and I'm lucky to be here." But you could see there were moments when the memories surfaced, and she would go very quiet. Privately, Sophie became more protective of her children than anyone outside the family realized. After Lady Louise's premature birth, Sophie would check on her daughter multiple times each night, even years later. When James was born in 2007, she reportedly insisted on constant monitoring during her pregnancy, terrified of another abruption. "It's as if she never stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop," said the friend. That level of anxiety wears on a person, even if they never show it. And yet, Sophie continued to perform her duties. Charity galas, state banquets, overseas tours. She smiled through them all, even as her body quietly protested. There were whispers among staff of Sophie occasionally stepping away to rest during long events, and of aides insisting she eat between engagements to keep her energy up. But in the royal family, admitting vulnerability has never been encouraged. "It's not just about the culture of silence," said royal historian Alicia Whitaker. "There's also an unspoken fear of being seen as weak. Royals are expected to endure. That's the legacy they've inherited. Now, With Sophie's hospitalization, the consequences of that mindset are becoming painfully clear. Doctors treating the Duchess are reportedly exploring whether a combination of cardiovascular strain and hormonal imbalance played a role in her collapse. Both conditions can be tied to her earlier medical traumas, particularly when compounded by years of chronic stress. "If you think of the body as a bank account," said Dr. Grant, "then Sophie's pregnancies made some very large withdrawals. Add to that 2 decades of emotional pressure, and it's no wonder her body has sounded the alarm." This theory resonates deeply with those who know her story. It suggests that the collapse wasn't sudden at all, but rather the result of years of cumulative strain. Yet within the palace, there are murmurs of unease. Could Sophie have been spared this if her early warnings were taken more seriously? If she had been encouraged to prioritize her own health over the relentless demands of duty? "She's always put everyone else first," said a longtime aide. Perhaps she believed that's what being royal meant. But maybe it's time for the family to rethink what it asks of people. The Duchess of Edinburgh is now under close observation as her doctors run further tests. For her family, it's a time of fear and reflection. For the public, it's a moment to consider how easily strength can become fragility when past trauma is left unresolved. And for Sophie herself, if she awakens fully aware of the scare she has given the world, one can only wonder, will she finally be allowed to heal? Or will the weight of duty demand that she once again set aside her own needs for the sake of the crown? As news of Sophie's sudden collapse spread through the royal household, all eyes turned to her husband, Prince Edward. To the world, Edward has always seemed the quietest of Queen Elizabeth's children, a man content to stay in the background while his elder siblings bore the weight of the crown's public scrutiny. But in this moment, as his wife lay in a hospital bed surrounded by worried doctors, Edward's calm veneer was shattered. Behind the walls of Frimley Park Hospital, he was no longer the Duke of Edinburgh. He was a husband fighting to keep the love of his life alive. Those closest to the couple described their marriage as one of quiet devotion. Unlike the high-profile unions of Edward's brothers and sister, Edward and Sophie's relationship has been largely free of drama. Over the years, their bond has been strengthened by shared hardships, none greater than the near-death experiences Sophie endured during her pregnancies. Friends of the couple recall the harrowing night in 2001 when Sophie was rushed to hospital for her ruptured ectopic pregnancy. Edward had been at home with her that evening, the two of them sharing a rare, quiet night away from royal duties. The suddenness of her collapse, the frantic ambulance ride, and the hours he spent pacing the hospital corridor waiting for news left an indelible mark on him. He thought he was going to lose her, said a friend who spoke on condition of anonymity. Edward was never quite the same after that night. He became fiercely protective of Sophie, almost to the point of obsession. 2 years later, history almost repeated itself when Sophie went into premature labor with Lady Louise. Edward was there again, clutching Sophie's hand as doctors worked to save both mother and child. He has rarely spoken publicly about that night, but in private conversations with close friends, Edward has admitted the fear of losing Sophie haunted him for years. That fear never really goes away, he reportedly told one confidant. You learn to live with it, but it's always there in the back of your mind. In the years since, Edward has made it his mission to shield Sophie from unnecessary stress. He has been known to step in quietly when she seemed overworked, suggesting she take a rare day off or accompanying her on particularly grueling tours. Yet Sophie, with her strong sense of duty, often brushed off these attempts, insisting she could handle the demands of royal life. Edward adored her for that strength, said the friend. But I think deep down he worried it was going to cost her one day. That day may have come, as Edward sat beside Sophie's hospital bed, holding her hand and watching the rise and fall of her chest. Witnesses say he was visibly shaken. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by an anxious energy as he consulted with doctors and fielded updates from palace aides. He's not leaving her side, said a hospital staffer. He's eating very little, sleeping even less. You can tell he's terrified. For Edward, the memory of Sophie's earlier health crises looms large. But this time, there's an added layer of guilt. Friends say Edward has been questioning whether he should have done more to encourage Sophie to slow down in recent months. He feels like he should have seen this coming, said the confidant. He knew she was tired, that she'd been pushing herself too hard. Now he's blaming himself for not putting his foot down. But in truth, Edward has never been one to issue ultimatums to his wife. Their relationship is built on mutual respect and an understanding that Sophie's role within the family is her own to define. They are partners in every sense of the word, said a royal aide. Edward has always been her anchor, but he's never tried to control her. He knew Sophie valued her independence. That independence is one of the qualities Edward admires most about Sophie. From the earliest days of their courtship, he was drawn to her confidence and her refusal to be intimidated by the trappings of royal life. Yet that same independence may have kept Sophie from expressing just how much her body was struggling. She didn't want to worry him, said the aide. Sophie wanted to be strong for Edward, just as he always tried to be strong for her. Now, the roles are reversed. With Sophie vulnerable and unresponsive, it is Edward who must summon the strength to hold their family together. At Bagshot Park, their two children, Lady Louise and James, Viscount Severn, are said to be deeply concerned about their mother. Louise, now 21, reportedly rushed home from university as soon as she heard the news. James, just 17, has remained at home with relatives, trying to support his father while grappling with his own fears. Edward is doing his best to comfort the children, said a family friend. But they can see the worry in his eyes. It's breaking his heart to see Sophie like this. Edward has always been regarded as one of the more private royals, rarely allowing the public a glimpse into his personal life. But as he paces the hospital corridors and whispers quiet prayers at Sophie's bedside, he is a man laid bare by love and fear. He doesn't care about titles or appearances right now, said a hospital staffer. All that matters to him is Sophie. You can see it in everything he does. For Edward, Sophie is not just a wife or the Duchess of Edinburgh. She is his partner, his confidant, the woman who stood beside him through life's storms. And now, as another storm rages, Edward is clinging to hope. Hope that the woman he loves has enough strength left to pull through once more. But as doctors work tirelessly to stabilize Sophie, there is a sobering realization in the air. Even the deepest love may not be enough to shield her from the toll of years spent putting duty before health. And for Edward, that is perhaps the most agonizing truth of all. As Sophie Wessex remained under close medical supervision, a heavy silence settled over the royal family. Within the gilded corridors of Buckingham Palace, aides moved quickly and quietly, their faces tense as they tried to manage the growing anxiety. Outside the walls, the public speculated and worried, but inside, there was only one question echoing among senior royals. What happens if Sophie doesn't recover? The Duchess of Edinburgh has always been described as the monarchy's quiet rock, not in the sense of fiery speeches or controversial headlines, but in her steadfast dedication to duty and her ability to navigate the often unforgiving terrain of royal life with grace. Now, however, the absence of her presence was felt acutely. King Charles III, already burdened with his own health struggles and the strain of leading a modernized monarchy, was said to be deeply concerned about his sister-in-law's condition. Palace insiders revealed that he had personally requested hourly updates on Sophie's status and asked his private secretary to prepare contingency plans should the Duchess remain incapacitated for an extended period. This isn't just about Sophie, one senior aide confided. It's about what her illness exposes about the system itself. She has been a cornerstone of the monarchy in recent years. If she falls, there's a domino effect. Since the departure of Harry and Meghan and the reduced visibility of Prince Andrew, the royal workload has fallen disproportionately on a smaller group of family members: Charles, Camilla, William, Kate, Anne, and Sophie and Edward. But even as the family rallied around each other in public, there were murmurs behind the scenes about the growing weight placed on those who remained. For Sophie, the increased demands were compounded by her reputation as a reliable, drama-free royal. Unlike others in the family who drew criticism or controversy, Sophie was universally praised for her empathy and her ability to connect with ordinary people. That made her a favorite among both the public and the monarchy's inner circle. But it also made her collapse all the more unsettling. "The palace is in shock," said one insider. "No one saw this coming. If someone like Sophie, who seemed unshakable, can end up in hospital like this, it makes everyone else question their own limits." At Bagshot Park, The atmosphere was somber. Lady Louise Windsor and James, Viscount Severn, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy under the watchful eyes of family staff. But with Edward spending nearly every waking hour at Sophie's hospital bedside, the absence of their mother's calming influence weighed heavily on the household. Family friends say that Louise has stepped into a caretaker role for her younger brother, making him meals and helping him with his studies as they both wait for news about their mother's condition. "They're a tight-knit family," said a friend. "This is hitting them hard." Louise remembers what happened when she was born. She's heard the stories about how her mother nearly didn't survive. That fear is very real for her. Meanwhile, at Frimley Park Hospital, doctors continued to monitor Sophie closely. Though she had regained consciousness briefly, her condition remained fragile. Medical teams were running a battery of tests, seeking to understand the cause of her collapse and to rule out any underlying conditions that might pose ongoing risks. "There's no clear answer yet," said a hospital source. "But given her medical history, we're being extremely cautious." That caution has extended to the palace's public statements as well. The initial announcement that Sophie was receiving the best possible care was followed by several days of silence. This vacuum of information has only fueled speculation, with tabloids running headlines like, "Is Sophie's collapse a royal health crisis?" and "The hidden strain of royal life." On social media, the reaction has been a mix of concern and criticism. Thousands of well-wishers posted messages of support under the hashtag #PrayForSophie, but others began questioning whether the monarchy's relentless schedule had pushed the Duchess too far. "She's been running herself into the ground for years," tweeted one royal watcher. "Why didn't anyone tell her to slow down?" It's a sentiment shared by some within the palace. According to one aide, there is now a growing recognition that the institution may need to rethink how it manages the health and well-being of its members. "There's been this idea that royals must keep going no matter what," said the aide. "But Sophie's collapse has forced us to confront the possibility that we've been asking too much." Behind the scenes, senior advisors have reportedly begun discussions about whether to scale back Sophie and Edward's engagements once the Duchess recovers. There is also talk of hiring additional staff to support their work and alleviate some of the pressure. But for now, those plans remain speculative. In the quiet halls of Frimley Park, Prince Edward sits vigil by his wife's side, holding her hand as the machines beep steadily around them. Friends say he has refused to leave, save for the occasional phone call to update family members and check in on his children. "Edward is exhausted," said one family friend. But he won't rest until Sophie is out of danger. As the hours stretch into days, the royal family's anxiety grows. Camilla, Queen Consort, has reportedly visited Sophie privately, offering comfort and support to Edward. Prince William and Princess Catherine have sent messages of encouragement and offered to assist with any engagements the Wessexes may need to cancel. But there is a palpable sense of unease lingering over the family. "This isn't just about Sophie's health," said royal historian Dr. Amanda Wallace. "It's about the fragility of the monarchy itself. If the institution doesn't learn from this, it risks burning out the very people keeping it afloat." For now, the world watches and waits. And as Sophie lies in that hospital room, one can only wonder if her collapse will serve as a wake-up call for the royal family, or if the cycle of silence and sacrifice will simply continue.